Monday. So let me hit record now to avoid that again. All right. So we've got our two presentations today with respect to the contemporary moral problem of euthanasia, or more specifically, physician-assisted suicide. And so I figure we can just let the groups begin, take it away, and then as a class, we can build on that for our discussion that will unfold subsequently. Before we get into that, are there any questions or any issues at all? No? All right, cool. So the slides look really good. I'm excited about this. Do you guys want me to share host status, or do you want me, as we did last time, to just proceed through the slides myself? It's up to you.
You could probably just like pull it up yourself, and then we'd be like next slide or something like that.
Slide or whatever. We can
Yeah.
go on from there. I have them pulled up already. Okay, so next week we're taking on the contemporary issue of environmental ethics, specifically climate change. And so the groups 5 and 6, you should expect an email from me at some point this afternoon with specific instructions, as I've been doing for the previous groups. And so let me know if there's any questions that you guys have. And so as a part of that email correspondence, I'll let you know which particular position you guys have to defend and so forth. All right. So without further ado, why don't we get going with Group A? So Group 4, which is taking the position A. That is arguing in favor of physician-assisted suicide. So that's Ronnie, Austin, and Sam. So are you guys ready to go? Do you want me to pull up the slides now? Cool. All right. Let me get those up here. And let me share the screen. Where is it?
All right, are we good to go?
Go ahead and take it away.
So as Justin already said, it was me, or Ronnie, Sam, and I, and we were in favor of euthanasia, or like you said, a physician-assisted suicide. And then you can go to the next one.
So our presentation will be about what euthanasia is, what its benefits are, what restrictions we can maintain in order to ensure maximum safety while maintaining the interests of the patient and their family, and what makes some acts of euthanasia justifiable and others not.
Do you want me to go to the next slide?
Yes, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
The other view of death is whole brain death, this being entire brain and brainstem death resulting in ceased heartbeat and body death. But some fail to account for the fact that the brain does not control every single bodily function. And then the other one's on the screen. Higher brain definition of death. You can go to the next slide.
And so basically euthanasia is derived from the Greek word of like an easy death, and it's almost basically just the act of the painless killing of a patient who is suffering from like a disease that is at this point incurable. So like in the sense of if someone is, it talked about someone having throat cancer where they were in pain every single day, and they really, like, there was no cure for it. There was, let's say they had like a week to live, and they were going to suffer for that whole week. Euthanasia would allow them to, end that suffering a little bit earlier. And it's found that euthanasia is illegal in most countries more often than not, but in the US there are a various amount of states that allow to a degree of legal assisted suicide, that being in Oregon, Washington, Montana, Colorado, and California, but still not too big all around the world. And you can go to the next.
So these are the different types of mercy killings that can be performed by doctors with their varying legality. Active voluntary euthanasia occurs when a patient consents to a direct mercy killing by a doctor. Active non-voluntary is when a patient does not have advance directive to say how they want to end their life, and their fate is decided instead by their family and their doctors, who actively perpetrate their death. And then active involuntary is when a patient is mercy killed by their doctor against their will and against their family's wishes. Passive voluntary is indirect killing through patient request by way of more of slowly killing the patient by not giving them something or things of that nature. Passive non-voluntary is killing which one moment. When a physician assists in a killing, but it's specified through an advance directive or by the family, but not verbally, consenting. And then passive involuntary is when the patient does not consent through advance directive and the doctor refuses administration of any medications that might save their life. You can move to the next slide.
We usually enact passive euthanasia by maintaining regimens of morphine in high doses, not only to control pain, but to suppress respiration, making the process of death not only faster, but painless. Patients deemed fit for non-voluntary passive euthanasia are those in persistent vegetative state with lack of advance directive, not having had these chances to write up a living will, whose family and team of doctors deemed their state hopeless. We do not condone involuntary passive euthanasia in any circumstances. You can go to the next slide.
So active euthanasia is basically perpetrating a patient's death like directly, as opposed to like letting them die slowly. So like I had said earlier about the case in somebody with like cancer or like a severe case of cancer where they were going to die eventually, but as opposed to letting them suffer, we bring that on like with an act of like lethal injection. And this is something where in like special cases that we would be in like we would agree with that. Just for the sake of, is it necessarily morally right to allow someone to suffer, or is it allow them like more morally right to, I mean, it's seen as bad to kill them, but to like allow them to reduce that degree of suffering. And this is obviously always on the patient's choice. It would never be something that would be involuntary. It would be discussed with not only the patient, but the family and the doctors, and not just something that a doctor would be like, all right, well, we're just going to kill this person on our own accord, but in their sense too. You can go to the next.
Some tend to become extremely anxious when contemplating their fate, and everybody prefers that their death be as quick and painless as possible. Patients universally have the right to refuse treatment, but they do not have the resources to deliver themselves from unbearable pain that cannot be calmed without loss of consciousness and personhood. Giving patients a means to an end of their suffering may alleviate the stress they feel when approaching their death. You can move on to the next slide.
So why do we hold one at a higher level of morality than another? If someone has no chance of survival and will be unbearably suffering until they die slowly, gives advance directive or otherwise written/verbal consent backed by their family and would experience more benefit due to active voluntary euthanasia as opposed to dying more slowly, what stops this form of mercy killing from being as acceptable as that of passive?
Want me to move on?
Yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, that's basically all we had. And so now we'll open up for like questions or anything like that. Yeah.
Why don't we hold off on questions until the next group presents, but let's give some applause for our presenters. Really nice job. It's a little awkward in the Zoom format, but yeah, really good. So let me stop this and then pull up, let me pull up the next presentation. Oops. All right, so now we will hear from group 3 representing viewpoint B. And so this group is Justin, Brianna, and Jace. So I will share the screen now. And we'll do this as we conducted it before. So just let me know when you want me to proceed to the next slide. Okay. All right, so let's give our 3 presenters our attention here.
So yeah, as you can see by the title card, we're going to present the arguments against physician-assisted suicide, me, Justin, and Brianna. Next slide. So the main reading we were tasked with covering was J. Gay Williams' The Wrongfulness of Euthanasia. In it, Williams states euthanasia is inherently wrong because it violates the nature and dignity of human beings. But even those who are not convinced by this must be persuaded that the potential personal and social dangers inherent in euthanasia are sufficient to forbid or approving it either as a personal practice or as public policy. And what this basically means is that he believes euthanasia is naturally wrong under any circumstance. But when you examine it at both a practical level and both in regard to human self-interest, you get even more reason to stand against it. He divides his arguments into 3 sections: arguments against nature, or arguments from nature, self-interest, and practical effects. And it should also be stated before we move on that he doesn't see passive euthanasia as euthanasia at all, but rather sees the death as a result of passive euthanasia as just like a result of the condition they were already in. So you can move on to the next slide. So like I said, Williams starts his argument with the argument from nature. His first point states, it's enough, I believe, to recognize that the organization of the human body and our patterns of behavior responses make the continuation of life a natural goal. By this reason alone, we can recognize that euthanasia sets us against our own nature. So this point takes like a natural law theory approach, stating that the body's natural objective is to survive and that euthanasia stands in the way of this natural objective. And Williams says that this alone is enough to recognize that euthanasia stands against human nature as a whole. He takes it one step further, saying that unlike animals, we're conscious through reason of our nature and our ends. Euthanasia involves acting as if this dual nature, inclination towards survival, and awareness of this being euthanasia as an end, didn't exist, and basically requires us to regard ourselves as something less than fully human. This quote's a little bit more confusing, but what it basically entails is that humans act on reason and are conscious of their own nature. And if that nature is to continue living, then humans tend to make calculated decisions based on reason to meet that objective. And Williams states that this nature as a whole is part of our basic human character and that euthanasia denies us of that, which he states requires us to regard ourselves as something less than fully human. So you can move on to the next slide. His next set of arguments are from human self-interest. His first point states, we may think that we have no hope of recovery when, as a matter of fact, our chances are quite good. In such circumstances, if euthanasia are permitted, we would die needlessly. Death is final, and the chance of error is too great to approve the practice of euthanasia. This point takes a bit of a utilitarian approach in the sense that death prevents us from ever experiencing any more good or happiness. Williams argues basically that the permanence of death can act against our own self-interest because, and as we'll see in some examples later in the presentation, we can't see everything that's going to happen in the future. Things like unexpected or experimental or untested treatments can always pop up, and even there are cases of miraculous recovery that doctors just couldn't predict. But death prevents any of those from being possible in the first place. He also states that the will to live is strong in all of us, but it can be weakened by pain and suffering and feelings of hopelessness. If during a bad time we allow ourselves to be killed, we can never have a chance to reconsider. Recovery from a serious illness requires that we fight it, and anything that weakens our determination by suggesting that there's an easy way out is ultimately against our own interests. And basically what this means is that when you have the option of euthanasia so readily available to take your own life, and based on like polls in the United States, so the majority of people morally accept it, it can kind of give people an incentive to give up fighting their condition, which for obvious reasons acts against our own self-interest because you'll die. Next slide. His last section is arguments that stem from practicality and the effects on like the real world in normalizing euthanasia. He first states that they being the doctors, might decide that the patient would simply be better off dead and take the necessary steps to make that come about. This attitude could carry over to their dealings with patients less seriously ill. And while some, the textbook people who are pro physician-assisted suicide might consider this a slippery slope argument, the idea that euthanasia can have a negative effect on healthcare as a whole isn't all that crazy. And as we'll see with the Daniel James case later, not everyone who dies of physician-assisted suicide is terminally ill. Another point Williams makes is that this, being the inability for some patients to speak for themselves, vegetative state, whatever, may well incline them to act on the behalf of other patients who have not authorized them to exercise their judgment. It's only a short step then from voluntary euthanasia, self-inflicted or authorized, to directed euthanasia administered to a patient who was given no authorization to involuntary euthanasia conducted as part of a social policy. This point's pretty self-explanatory. It basically it states that when someone doesn't have the ability to express their desire for euthanasia or not, somebody else is tasked with making that choice. And that can call into a question the authority, like morally, because we're supposed to separate the moral and legal argument here. Morally, who can authorize the ending of a life that isn't their own. Next slide. Yeah. So before we move on, I just want to present what.
Sorry.
I want to present a scenario just to get you all thinking about the morality of assisted suicide. There are questions at the end that I want you to think about, but obviously we're not going to stop in the middle of the presentation to answer them right now. So the scenario goes as follows. Suppose someone was in an extremely deep to the depressive state to the point where it was negatively affecting their everyday life. They fell into a suicidal mindset. And suppose somebody well-versed in mental health issues, a therapist, counselor, somebody like that, after providing pretty much as much mental health support as possible, assesses that this person's lost all hope for recovery and is probably going to end up dead, whether via suicide, malnutrition, something like that. And knowing this, they go and retrieve the supplies for a suicide attempt and hand deliver them to the patient. In this rhetorical scenario, would you say that the mental health expert who retrieved the supplies would be morally wrong in this case? And regardless of the answer, how does this differ from a doctor, another medical expert, believing that a patient has no hope for physical recovery, actively retrieving lethal doses of drugs, handing them to the patient, knowing full well that the patient's probably going to die later on, regardless of that? Just something to get you thinking. And then I'm also going to give you a quote from Liz Carr's Euthanasia for Disabled People, which you can find at the end of the chapter 10 of the textbook. She says that suicide is not seen as socially desirable. So why is assisted suicide seen as compassionate for people, or why is assisted suicide seen as compassionate when it's for ill or disabled people? So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Justin, who's going to go over some of the moral theories that we've covered in class and their arguments against physician-assisted suicide. Cool.
Can you hit next slide for me? The first ethical theory we will be talking about was defined by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism. In all of its forms, it relies on the weight of consequences rather than rules, and it places emphasis on the good and the bad rather than what's right or wrong. In this scenario, the consequences don't really get any bigger than death. Utilitarianism is also thought of in a broad, generalized way, but there are many flavors of it, and today we will be focusing on act and rule utilitarianism. With act, one is allowed to break a moral rule, such as the case with physician-assisted suicide. However, there must be a reason to believe that breaking the rule will cause maximum utility, or the perfect balance between good over evil for all involved. But this brings about the problem of a person taking one's own interest into consideration more over everyone else's, along with breaking of a moral rule. Both theories believe that if the consequences of the results to exception are better than the moral rule itself, then the action is justifiable. So with each individual that wants to undergo physician-assisted suicide in their particular situation, in their eyes, has better results by proceeding with the physician's assistance, then it's justifiable to do so. But since the individual with the situation decides which action produces the better consequences, shouldn't there be a stipulation with each individual on what constitutes a better consequence and what that entails? So in its simplest form, Act Utilitarianism is the goal. If the goal is to maximize happiness, euthanasia runs directly against that goal. If one is killed, then there is no possibility of future happiness. And for the rule, allowing physician-assisted suicide as a general rule would damage any moral value that the medical profession holds. A physician's job is to heal and protect life. Killing patients goes directly against that job. Next slide. The next ethical theory to be discussed is Kantian deontology that was developed by Immanuel Kant. Kant believes that the categorical imperative is the fundamental principle that is the basis of all moral responsibilities. The categories imperative is based on two formulations, but we will only be addressing one of these formulations. The one that is most prominent within the context of this situation is the second formulation, which says, treat humanity never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. Kant furthers his formulation by breaking it down into 4 different duties. Of the 4 duties, the perfect duties to others, the perfect duties to self, and imperfect duties to others are the 3 that are relevant to our topic of physician-assisted suicide. The perfect duties to others include respecting others. Examples include not killing innocent people, keeping promises, and not lying. There is no exception, like utilitarian, in breaking these duties. They are simply off limits. With perfect duties to self, you are not supposed to disrespect yourself. The act, and again, to summarize, the act of euthanasia entails treating a person as a mere disposable thing, and that goes against Kant's idea of human intrinsic worth. Kant is also thoroughly against suicide as it robs a person of their personhood, the foundation of all their moral values. And a quote from Kant would be, but the rule of morality does not admit of suicide under any condition because it degrades human nature below the level of animal nature and so destroys it. Next slide. Over the last 2 decades, social concerns with the right to die have grown beyond our ability of our governmental and judicial institutions to consistently deal with them. One reason for this difficulty has been the unavailable of any legal or judicial standard that is consistent with the American conceptions of liberty, morality, and justice. This attempts to examine the theory of natural law to determine whether it may provide a consistent standard for resolving these difficult questions. As natural law theories are traced through history, they lead directly to the United States, where a uniquely American interpretation became one of the foundational principles for our Constitution. By applying these theories to the contemporary question of the right to die, natural law can again provide the foundational principles needed to develop standards for dealing with such questions that are consistent with our historical, philosophical, and political traditions. So according to the natural law theory, any act of euthanasia with the intention of killing, according to the doctrine of the double effect, is never permissible, as this theory says that we have a moral duty to preserve life. So a question for you to consider is giving a patient a large dose of morphine with the intention of alleviating their pain still morally permissible if the alleviation is the patient's expected death as a result of the action? Would this alleviation of death still be considered a good intention at all under the doctrine of double effect? Next slide. So at this point, I'm sure some of you have some objections to what we've said. So I'm going to talk about some of the most common objections that I think you guys might come up with. The first one being, there you go. Physician-assisted suicide is a merciful way for one to end their own life, is often said. While this is an optimistic way to look at this, Gay Williams, as well as the theories of utilitarianism, argues that it still acts against one's own self-interest, as the permanence of death takes away any possible good in the future. Another objection may be if physician-assisted suicide, the patient is the final causal agent of the death, and therefore is more morally acceptable than something like a lethal injection. In both cases, the actions of the physician directly lead to the death of another, regardless of who actually performs that final act. And one last one is, the doctrine of double effect says that giving lethal doses of morphine with the intention of alleviating the patient's pain is okay, even if the patient's death is expedited, as the death was foreseen but not intended. The wording behind this may be misleading. In this case, we know full well that when administering doses of morphine, the alleviation of pain translates to death and nothing else. So we can't exactly call the death an unintended consequence. So now I'm going to turn this over to Brianna to go over some of the most well-known people and some situations in this scenario we're talking about today. You can go to the next slide.
So just a few examples of the arguments in moral theories include Daniel James, a 23-year-old man who's paralyzed in a rugby accident, but was not terminally ill. Not wanting to live as a disabled second-class citizen, he chose to seek out the Swiss clinic Dignitas, which aids in assisted suicide and is also illegal in the United Kingdom. This calls into question the moral correctness of the Swiss clinic, who aided him in suicide knowing full well he came from a country where it was outlawed. This can also be tied back to Gay Williams' concern that doctors could become more complacent with their work, and the criteria needed to qualify for assisted suicide could become increasingly blurry. Karen Ann, you can go to the next slide, sorry. Karen Ann Quinlan suffered from acute brain damage and was left in a persistent vegetative state after an accident with alcohol combined with a tranquilizer, and was connected to a feeding tube and a respirator, which mechanically maintained her breathing. After many months and thoughtful deliberation, her family, with the court's approval, decided to allow her to die in 1976 by way of unplugging her respirator. However, she continued to breathe independent of her respirator until 9 years later in 1985. This contributes to the idea that doctors and physicians, as educated as they may be, can be mistaken in their predictions, and unexpected occurrences are very possible. This situation could be related back to Gay Williams' argument that euthanasia, even though Gay Williams would not consider the situation euthanasia at all, can work against self-interest, as there is always potential for the unexpected. Next slide, please. Terry Shava spent 15 years in a persistent vegetative state due to a heart issue. Her husband spoke on her behalf because she had no living will and no record of her wishes should she become in her feeding tube according to his claimed recollection she might recover after going back and forth off the feeding tube and died. This calls into question the moral permissibility of assisted suicide when no written will is left behind. This also echoes Gay Williams' concern about others speaking on the patient's behalf. Next slide, please. Dr. Kevorkian, Dr. Death, was a doctor that eventually helped many terminally ill people commit suicide by way of a suicide machine, convicted of murder in 1999 for 10 to 25 years in prison because assisting suicide is illegal in the state of Michigan, where he was practicing. It was later alleged that many of his patients were depressed at the time of suicide, which calls into question the mental competence of those requesting it. This situation helps portray Gay Williams' point about how the weakening of one's determination to live can lead people to give up easier, acting against our own self-interest. And these are just 4 examples.
Yeah, the next slide is just the references.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're
Sorry, you're cutting out there, Brianna, at the end. I wasn't sure if you were finished. All right. So let's stop that and let's give our presenters from group 3 a round of applause, or the little 2-dimensional clapping hands is fine as well. All right, so really good job, guys. So now let's open it up for questions. And so questions that you might have can be directed to either of the groups. And so anyone representing the groups can respond. So who has some questions? Yeah, Connor, go ahead.
Regarding Kantian's perspectives and whatnot, and like suicide being very thoroughly against one's self-interest and whatnot, or self-preservation, what about his perspective on like maintaining somebody's autonomy? So disallowing somebody to end their own life is kind of like taking away their freedom to act on their own will. in their own way with their own, existence and whatnot.
Well, I don't know. I can say there's many ways to interpret it, but I'd say when it comes to Kantianism, suicide was one of those, like, those perfect duties, one of those things that you're not supposed to do, in a sense. It was one of those completely objective, you can't break this rule. And so the way we look at it, suicide, regardless of the method, is wrong under any circumstance.
Yeah, good. So just to be clear, Kant's sense of autonomy is really quite specific. If one is acting against reason, if one is acting contrary to or in contradiction to the pronouncements of reason, then one is not acting autonomously. One is in fact acting heteronomously, according to Kant, which means by appeal to reasons that are outside of one's agential source of norms. And so one is always, for Kant, at the same time, a subject and a legislator for the universal moral law, which we interpret in terms of carrying out and specifying our duties. And so if you act in accordance with some sort of biological impulse or some other sort of physical desire, that is in fact a heteronomous reason. So even if that is a desire to no longer be in pain, a Kantian might say, even if it's a very strong impetus that is influencing your decision making, that decision making is no longer free because it's not carried out or pursued in the context of free rationality or free reason, right? So that's just to clarify a little bit what Kant means by autonomy. Because if we have a sort of abstract or generalized view of what autonomy entails, well, then you might say, according to Kant, one should be able to do whatever the hell they feel like. And that would amount to freedom. But sort of counterintuitively, by the lights of this theory, if one is freely acting or thinking that they're freely acting, but on the basis of non-rational or pre-reflective desires, well, they're actually acting in contravention to their freedom. They're not expressing or realizing their freedom. So then freedom for Kant as a function of autonomy or a way of expressing autonomy really doesn't mean being able to do whatever the hell you feel like. Right? So that's just important to get clear about. Good, so.
Thank you both.
Yeah, other questions? But yeah, you responded well, Jace. So your response was basically that suicide would be a violation of a perfect duty. And so I was just articulating a clear sense in accordance with which Kant could arrive at that argumentative conclusion. And so you would say, to flesh it out a little bit more, that taking one's own life for whatever reason is contrary to this fundamental self-love, which connects to one's personhood insofar as one is dignified, for example. And so that's why it's irrational, because it's contradictory. Now, of course, you can argue against that, but that's the way he arrives at the conclusion. Okay, so good. So who has some other questions for our presenters? Connor, yeah, go ahead.
It's not so much a question, but it might be somewhat relevant. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of or seen, I think it's called the Onion News. It's kind of like a mock news station that is a big joke based on very real things. Either way, there's one episode that goes on to talk about the death sentence, and in the determination of whether or not it should be allowed or used, one of the judges is like, no, I think that the death sentence the death sentence should not be allowed, because they should instead be sent to some isolated place where they just have to fend for their lives for the rest of however long they get to live, constantly fighting and whatnot, which kind of made me think of the whole difference between letting someone die and killing them or taking their life. Because after that, in the episode, they go on to explain how that's way more brutal and gruesome to, sentence them to, live as long as they can, not, not being able to live any longer.
Yeah, so was that a question or?
No.
No, but I mean, that's an interesting connection to make to another different but importantly relevant and related issue of capital punishment, right? The state's authority to end a life. One might say from a Kantian interpretation that that's contradictory, perhaps in a similar way that we identified the problem with suicide. But yeah, does anyone from the two groups or otherwise have anything to say in connection to that or in response to that?
Well, I think that's kind of interesting. Connor, I don't know if you were saying that these people are claiming that it's more merciful to kill them as opposed to letting them sit like in the system. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with Just Mercy, but it recently became more popular. And actually people who are in this process of being in the capital punishment system, they don't want to die. Like even if they are guilty, they constantly fear this day and they ask people to essentially get them out of it, even if they are guilty. And so I think actually it kind of comes down to this idea that humans don't really ever want to die. At least I think, well, okay, maybe in some situations if people are incredibly mentally ill, but the human nature kind of seems to create this overwhelming feeling in us that we don't want to die. Like there are people who have jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and realized after the fact that they don't want to die. And so I think that's really applicable when you think about physician-assisted suicide, because these people who think they want to die, it is potentially likely that they actually don't.
Yeah, so that was, I think, to build on one of the insights or one of the features of the argument from group 3, right? So from the second presenters. But I wonder, so does anyone have a question? I have a question for the first group. I was wondering if you guys might respond to this Kantian prohibition against physician-assisted suicide by appeal to a way that a deontologist, a Kantian, might really defend the practice under certain circumstances. So like Ronnie, Austin, or Sam, do you have any sense of, and this is departing perhaps from the purview of James Rachel's, insofar as he doesn't necessarily ground his approach to the matter in Kantianism, but I don't think his conclusion is at odds with the thinking of Kantianism. But what do you guys think about that? How might a Kantian actually defend the practice of physician-assisted suicide?
I mean, I kind of feel that like if a person's suffering is far greater than the happiness that they are like feeling while they are living, like whether it, I think a lot of times in like depression or something like that, if somebody just wants to die through like mentally unstable areas, I can't see it being something that's necessarily acceptable, but being things through like disease and illness, if someone's suffering is far greater than the happiness that they are feeling, why make them suffer even more? Especially if it's just going to end in death anyway. Why make them suffer for an extra week, an extra month, when they can just end that early and be at peace in death?
I mean, that's a reasonable response.
Yeah, I agree. And
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I also think that in the book it says performing something like a physician-assisted suicide would kind of show the person's worth, the person's, like right to choose what they want to do, and yeah, like just to be their own person.
Yeah, so we're going back then to the question of autonomy, right? But to speak to Austin's point from a moment ago, like I was saying, it's a sensible response, but I think it presupposes, perhaps inaccurately, that Kant as someone who gives a shit at all about anybody's happiness. Right? So happiness is of central significance from a utilitarian point of view, right? If we understand pleasure as one way of expressing the idea of happiness, just to keep it rather simplistically as a kind of identity between pleasure and happiness, this, from Kant's point of view, is an entirely heteronymous, that is, non-autonomous motivation for any action whatever. So you might say, well, why can't I lie in this situation? Or why can't I, steal this loaf of bread to feed my suffering family? After all, it will be conducive to our well-being and our happiness. Well, Kant would say, well, your interest in happiness is well below the dignity and self-respect of a rational agent like a human being. Cows and pigs and maybe even fruit flies care about happiness, but human beings are above that, right? And so this is what motivates Kant's original critique of Aristotelian eudaimonism, the idea that if all there is to our being as humans is the pursuit of happiness, well then why were we endowed with the faculty of reason, which more often than not seems to stand as an obstacle to the furtherance of our happiness, because it tells us, no, you can't or you shouldn't do such and such action simply for the sake of your own well-being, or even the well-being of others that you care about. Kant's whole deontological system is to say that that is an extraneous concern from the point of view of morality. And so I think what Ronnie was getting at in her response had to do with this sense of respect, right? In this case, since we're talking about suicide or euthanasia, self-respect. Can anyone maybe speak to that a little more and Ronnie mentioned that this was in fact discussed by Vaughan in the textbook. So a Kantian might appeal to this category of respect and the significant place that it has in this deontological moral system or approach as salient here, as particularly relevant. And so how might one do that? And it's really under special circumstances, I think. So it's not a universal or catch-all given justification for the legitimacy of suicide by any means. But there seem to be, in any case, arguably particular conditions under which a Kantian might accept that it's morally permissible for one to end one's own life. But does anyone have a sense of that, or does anyone remember the argument from the textbook?
I don't think I made it or quite remember the argument, but what comes to mind right off the bat is, oh, hold on, I just had it. It's like, I don't know, it makes me think of the treating people as not merely a means, but also as an end, is like, because they're people and because all people have like this equal amount of value and whatnot. That's what comes to mind when Ronnie was saying that, euthanasia might essentially show a person's value, respecting both their decisions and yeah.
Yeah, but so good. The question now is, under what specific conditions can one's respect be legitimately recognized through an act of self-annihilation? So Kant's whole view against that we find in that perfect duty that proscribes, right, that is entirely opposed to the moral viability of suicide, it's predicated, and this is where the contradiction comes in. So Kant supposes that the potential suicide is motivated towards this eventual act on the basis of a kind of self-love. So the person says, out of self-love, having in view that the furtherance of my life promises more pain and agony than it does satisfaction or pleasure, I am going to end that life. And so the contradiction is, out of self-love, I'm going to destroy the very self that I love. But couldn't we argue from the same basic Kantian presuppositions from the same basic conceptual starting point, couldn't we say that under special circumstances, again, very limited conditions, a potential suicide might be expressing this sort of self-relation of adequate, that is non-pathological self-love, by appeal to a particular self-conception, which is a self-conception grounded in autonomy, rationality, which above all else for Kant, in fact, exclusively is what demands or commands respect. So for Kant, and this connects both of the two first formulations of the categorical imperative, for Kant, a moral action is always motivated by the maxim or the incentive of respect. And so what is it exactly that we have to respect when we're engaging in the world, when we're considering to undertake actions from a moral vantage? What are we respecting? Well, we're not really respecting an individual's self as a bodily organism, right? Because that would mean that the individual in question, the human person that we're talking about, is commensurate with a so-called lower animal, right? So we don't respect other human beings because they're a kind of biological organism comparable to other living entities in the world. In fact, if I view myself reductively as purely an animal, as exclusively a material biological organism, then I don't deserve any respect at all. I don't deserve any respect whatsoever for Kant. So when we respect someone, we are respecting specifically the way in which, through their actions, driven by certain choices and decisions, manifest or instantiate the universal laws of reason, which, as autonomous human subjects, we participate in legislating for everyone, universally, that is, intersubjectively. So when I respect myself, I'm respecting myself in a lower, in fact, deeply misguided and pathological sense if I'm respecting my own bodily organism. But if I'm respecting myself as the seat of intersubjective reason that I share with everybody else, then I'm not really caring about myself as a discrete living individual, right? I am respecting myself to the extent that I am capable of doing what any other rational agent is capable of doing. Even if we're talking about a dolphin or an extraterrestrial. Kant wouldn't include dolphins in that, but they clearly, by empirical research, appear to be rational beings to some extent. But so in other words, when I respect legitimately, so using this as a piece of technical terminology, when I deploy respect in the Kantian sense, I am respecting rationality. And so now we can say, in certain conditions, if your very rationality, the seat that undergirds and makes possible your autonomy as such, and thus your very respectability at all, if under certain conditions that is undermined because of disease or bodily impairment or unrelenting pain and agony, such that I can't even think, and then I get drugged up on morphine and my cognitive powers are even more undermined, so I can't form a rational thought whatsoever, well, then a Kantian might argue that it's out of respect for the preservation of my dignity as a rational agent that I would end that life, since I have been reduced to something lower or less than a human. Right? Does that make sense? So what are your thoughts on that? So the opposing group, so the group led by Brianna, Jace, and Justin, I think did a good job of laying out how these various moral theoretical frameworks would oppose, or could at least be put to work to explain an oppositional stance with respect to euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. But what do you guys think about the alternative interpretation of Kantianism? Do you think that that's plausible, or do you think the opposing view is stronger in its reasoning?
don't know. I mean, personally, I just based on like what I read through the textbook and stuff, obviously it's to a certain extent, but it seems to be a lot of the moral theory seems to be like subjective to a point. Obviously with Kantianism there's like rules and regulations that you always must follow, but obviously there's multiple ways to interpret it, and so like the pro or the Kantianism side that would argue for physician assisted suicide, I wouldn't call it necessarily wrong. The logic's there and it makes sense. But I'd say, you know, in the case of this, it's been clearly like laid out more that suicide is just wrong under any circumstance. Whereas with that, you gotta, okay, this is the case, then this is the case, then this is the case. And then we get to the point that Kantianism supports physician-assisted suicide. So I feel like Kantianism makes a stronger and more clear argument against physician-assisted suicide with its like most basic rules.
Yeah, so I mean, you're right to point out that in connection to these various moral theories and how they would respond to these moral questions, there's a degree of subjectivity involved. And that's important because the factor of one having to make a choice, one having to put forward a good faith interpretation of how to apply any one of these moral theoretical frameworks to a given problem is never something that can be set aside or eliminated, right? So this is the sense in which we can't turn to any of these moral theories as algorithms in which we can put some mathematical input and then through a function get some determinate output that tells us, oh, okay, well, I put in, you know, this, and then Kantianism is the machine at work, this sort of function, and it tells me answer B. And so that's what we have to do. And so this is a kind of existentialist point, that no matter how clear the guidance appears to be from any one of these major theoretical starting points or lenses through which to interpret and reflect on the world, one still must undertake that interpretation oneself. And so you can't just go to a Kantian or a utilitarian or a natural law theorist and say, all right, here's the input, run it through your little algorithm, give me the answer I want, and then go away. I don't need to deal with you anymore. It's not so simple, right? So you're always going to have to make a choice. And as the existentialist Kierkegaard would say, when it comes to anything at all, do it or don't do it. Either way, you're going to regret it. I mean, that's kind of a joke, especially if we apply it to any of these really serious problems. But I mean, there's something to it, even as a joke, right? There is no clear-cut answer that's going to allow you to wash your hands of any further deliberation, right? There's always some more subtle, nuanced aspect or angle that perhaps you didn't yet consider. But then, so having said that, you might say, okay, well, from one reading of Kant, you can do this. From another reading of Kant, you can't do it. So what's the fucking point? Well, not exactly, because that's a little superficial, right? Even if we say that Kant does give some reason to endorse physician-assisted suicide, it's under extreme specificity and limitations, right? So it would have to be in these extreme circumstances in which your autonomy is entirely undermined. You can't even make a rational decision. But then you might ask, well, to what extent are you capable of making the rational decision of ending it all? So maybe that's another way to approach the problem. Maybe if you are so compromised physically and mentally because of a disease or an impairment or ongoing suffering and pain that you can't make a decision one way or another, then that act of killing yourself would always be heteronymous. So that's a different way to go about thinking it, right? So it's a very complicated issue. Okay, so any comments or questions on that? So what about other questions or comments for the group? or for both groups or either groups. So maybe let's do a kind of poll like we did last time. So in the chat, so what do you guys think, just in terms of the arguments presented today? Which side is more persuasive? Which side has the stronger conclusion? Is it the pro side in favor of physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, or euthanasia, or is it the opposing side? So I'll first ask, who thinks that the pro side, that physician-assisted suicide is morally permissible, or at least can be morally permissible? Because Rachel's, of course, doesn't say it's always okay. He does, in fact, qualify its permissibility, but who thinks that the pro side had the better argument? So yeah, you can do a thumbs up, or I guess that's the easiest way about it. If you can do the little thumbs up. Okay. Handful of people, I think I counted 5 or 6 thumbs up. So now, who thinks that the opposing side had a more persuasive argument, a more compelling argument?
So I just want to say, I think honestly, the opposing side might have like a lot more justification and argument, but I feel like in favor of euthanasia has maybe stronger argument, whereas opposing euthanasia has more points. I don't describing that.
I feel like it's very hard to come up with a bunch of different arguments like that, just because of how restrictive you have to be with something like euthanasia. You can't just go around doing it all, willy-nilly. You have to have a lot of different, things in place to ensure that it doesn't go awry.
Yeah, and is that because something like the worry expressed in John Gay Williams' piece about the slippery slope, is that because there's something to that? There's something considerable to that worry? You guys think that that's
yes?
Yeah, and I'm not so sure that Rachel's would disagree, right? And I'm not so sure that the handful of states, so the 6 states in the US, including the District of Columbia, that have some version of what we call in Oregon, the Death with Dignity Act, they wouldn't disagree either, right? So we looked at the specific language circumscribing when one is a potential candidate, a legitimate candidate for physician-assisted suicide, and the constraints under which a participating physician or pair of physicians, if we're talking about the consulting as well as the attending physician, can perform the functions of those roles, right? It's very precise and very, there are a number of loops or hoops, so to speak, that one would have to jump through, either as a viable candidate or as a participating physician. And that is to maybe give expression to the legitimacy of some of these slippery slope concerns. But what do you guys think? I mean, it's not an accident, as we saw weeks ago, discussing chapter 3 of our textbook, that slippery slope is the name of a particular informal fallacy, right? So, I mean, there is something to worrying about how one seemingly innocent move or even one seemingly noble gesture can lead on a roll of cascading effects to something entirely unexpected and terrible. But I mean, shouldn't we, given that the slippery slope that's anticipated or that's thematized and connected to this particular ethical issue can only be verified in its accuracy or truth through data right? Empirical research. And it doesn't seem to be the case, looking at states like Oregon, that slippery slope concern has bore itself out in any substantial way, right? So what do you guys think about that? So how strong should we, or how seriously should we take the slippery slope concern?
So, I mean, I think, well, in the Gay Williams paper, he recognized that it's a slippery slope, and he kind of went further with it than I probably would. I mean, he went, total collapse of medical care, which, I'll put it out there. I don't think euthanasia will destroy healthcare as a whole, but I do think there's like some legitimacy to this, to the concerns, and you can recognize his point without going all the way down the slope, in a sense.
Mhm.
In the fact, or in the sense that euthanasia absolutely has the possibility to have negative effects on healthcare. Something like the Daniel James case, where the stuff becomes a lot more blurry, right? He wasn't terminally ill, he was just paralyzed. He wasn't going to die anytime soon. They knew he was from the UK, and they knew that it was physician-assisted suicide was illegal in the UK, and they still performed the action. And that's just something. It's just like one example to bring up where his point kind of still stands, but at the same time, obviously, you don't want to go all the way down the slippery slope.
Yeah, but then it's like, this is the problem with slippery slope arguments and why it's
Mm-hmm.
identified as a fallacy. How do you know where to stop? I mean, the problem is that it's a slippery slope because you're stumbling down it.
Mm-hmm.
So exactly where do you know when to stop? That is to say, when you're being reasonable about these potential problems or outcomes, and when you're inventing boogeymen.
Right.
And so just looking at Gay Williams' own argument, I mean, he makes some pretty quick, not very robustly defended moves, right? When he says, let's see, a person apparently hopelessly ill may be allowed to take his own life. Okay. Then he may be permitted to deputize others to do it for him, should he no longer be able to act. Okay, so that just means I can say, given that I have a terminal disease, I don't want to go on living. But now let's say I'm in a vegetative state, but I've made it clear in my advance directive that under these conditions, I will know I don't want to be preserved artificially. And so then he says, the judgment of others, or excuse me, the judgment of others then becomes the ruling factor. Already at this point, euthanasia is not personal and voluntary, for others are acting on behalf of the patient as they see fit. And I would say, whoa, slow down there. All we've said is you can go to my advance directive and see that if I am a fucking vegetable, I wouldn't like to be connected to artificial equipment, right? I'm not sure how he makes that move. It's not, again, very well justified or defended. And then the bit about in the event that voluntary euthanasia is made legal or physician-assisted suicide, doctors and nurses might not try hard enough to save the patient. I mean, what do you guys think about that reason?
Yeah, I don't know. I read the paper. I was tasked with defending his argument. I don't agree with everything he says per se.
Yeah,
but I do think he brought up some, I'll put it out there, even though I was arguing against I'm for physician-assisted suicide personally. But like through, the research I've done for this presentation and stuff, like Williams and the textbook itself, it does bring up some valid points about the concerns behind euthanasia and what it could lead to. Obviously, I mean, I don't think it'll collapse healthcare, but there are concerns there.
Right, there are concerns for sure, which I think to me most strongly in terms of this whole rhetorical approach point to not the universal problematicity or immorality, basically, of legitimizing euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, but rather to the ongoing necessity of significantly restraining it and putting it under constraints, such as we find in Oregon, right? So you can't just be depressed. It has to be a well-documented and verified, confirmed terminal illness and so forth. But then again, there is the legitimate concern that we're dealing with a science, and science, accurately speaking, is always incomplete. So these diagnoses could in fact be wrong. And I think there's something to that consideration that Gay Williams gives us. So that is a legitimate point. But then again, it might be painting things with too broad of a brush. I mean, I can imagine many circumstances in which it's a little willfully naive to expect something of what in these cases would be legitimately a miracle. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. But we're going to get out of here early today, but I want us to talk in a little closer detail about what I take to be the crux of James Rachel's argument. And so to put Gay Williams and Rachel's together into a kind of dialogue, as we've seen, as the presenters very nicely observed and pointed out and clarified, according to Gay Williams, what we call, as we've seen through the reading in chapter 10, passive voluntary euthanasia or passive non-voluntary euthanasia is not euthanasia at all, according to Gay Williams. And then for Rachel's part, he says that both are cases of euthanasia, but they're functionally equivalent. So there's no real salient moral difference between a physician doing something to end the life of a patient and a physician simply withdrawing or withholding necessary medical procedures or medicine in order to keep the life going. But what do you guys think about that? Do you remember the weird thought experiment involving Smith and Jones and the 6-year-old cousin? So what was that thought experiment?
That was about somebody who, if their nephew, or was it their niece or their nephew?
It might have been the nephew. I said cousin, but I think it might be nephew, actually. Yeah.
One of those things. When they die, they'll get the inheritance money. So then they think it's a good idea to now go and drown the nephew. But when they go into the bathroom, they see that the nephew has hit his head and slipped and is already drowning. So now this person is just standing here and watching them die and not doing anything about it. Essentially just letting them pass away instead of directly killing them. And the argument is, when you see a situation like this, is one doing like an active killing more permissible over a passive killing, just watching somebody die, having the means to help them and not doing anything? Is it really better?
Yeah. So Smith is a guy who has this 6-year-old nephew, and if the nephew dies, Smith will stand to inherit a great deal of money. He goes into the bathroom and actually does hold down the kid's head, drown them. And then Jones, on the other hand, is going to do the exact same thing for the exact same reason, walks into the bathroom. Before they can go about drowning the kid, they see him slip, hit his head, and then be submerged under the water. He stands around just in case the kid manages to raise his head above the water so that he could push it down again. Turns out he doesn't need to. The kid is unconscious. You can just stand there and watch him die. So on the one hand, we have an action that is actively contributing to and leading to the result of death. On the other hand, we get a kind of inaction which might be said to functionally lead to precisely the same result. So as an external observer, say a juror or a judge, if both of these cases were brought to court for criminal or civil litigation, what would your interpretation be in terms of the moral status of both situations, that is, of both actions? Because in the case of Jones, it's an inaction, but as we've discussed in other Zoom class sessions, that's a kind of action, right? So if, as Gay Williams seems to say, not only is it the case that voluntary, active and passive euthanasia are different, but what we call passive euthanasia is not euthanasia at all. According to Rachel's, this kind of thought experiment demonstrates their interchangeability, right? Their moral identity, their moral equivalency, that there's no real significant difference. But what do you guys think about that? Do you think that that has some sense to it? Or would you say, so just to go to the text, he says, now Smith killed the child, whereas Jones merely, and he uses these scare quotes, Jones merely let the child die. That is the only difference between them. Did either man behave better from a moral point of view? If the difference between killing and letting die were in itself a morally important matter, one should say that Jones's behavior was less reprehensible than Smith's. But does one really want to say that? I think not. And then he, a little bit further down the page, he says, now suppose that we are in court and this character Jones pleads in his own defense, after all, I didn't do anything except just stand there and watch the child drown. I didn't kill him, I only let him die. Again, if letting die were in itself less bad than killing, this defense should have at least some weight, but it does not. Such a defense can only be regarded as a grotesque perversion of moral reasoning. Morally speaking, it is no defense at all. So what do you guys think about that?
So, and yeah, I've read that, and afterwards, I thought it was like a really good piece. They kind of show, well, essentially, whereas I would agree, and with the pro euthanasia argument, I don't think that letting these patients die or whatever, letting them die is something completely different. Like in the case where they went to pull the plug and whatnot, and with the intent for them to like just starve for the next week or 2 weeks or something like that, that is totally different in my opinion, and I definitely don't agree with that piece of the argument.
Wait, so what was your view again?
So that essentially, yeah, I think that letting someone die is not euthanasia, because I find myself agreeing with, maybe lethal injection if the person's in this state that is just like, otherwise they want to die, other people agree that they should be allowed to die, so let's bring that about, rather than someone who maybe can't speak for themselves, and everybody's in agreement, okay, yeah, they should maybe get to be put out of their misery, but instead of lethal injection and making it a rather quick thing, they decide, well, we'll just not feed them for a week or two, or let them suffocate, or any of these other very unpleasant sounding experiences. So I think that they're two very different things, and I agree with euthanasia and not with letting die, because I don't think letting die is euthanasia.
But so Rachel's point is, functionally, if the end result is death, well, then the only difference, and this is really the thrust of his argument and its conclusion, the only difference is how long and gruesome are you, as the authority involved in this particular kind of case or situation, how long, protracted, and gruesome are you willing to allow the termination of the life to be? So the case was given, I think, quite powerfully of infants, for example, who are born with Down syndrome. Sometimes they need a relatively simple surgery to correct an intestinal blockage, which, if not attended to, will result quite naturally in the child's death. But sometimes the doctor simply withholds this treatment, so allows the intestinal blockage, after, of course, consulting with the parents, allowing the intestinal blockage to remain. The child dies, but it's not immediate, right? It takes a long time. The child just has to sort of wither away from lack of water, lack of nutrition, and so forth. When if the end result projected, the end result functionally, according to Rachel's intended, in fact, is the death of the child, well, then why not just get it over with? Why should the child have to go on suffering and in horrible pain and agony when we all know, we shouldn't deceive ourselves with this sort of naivety, what's going to happen, right? So that's, really the crux of Rachel's conclusion. And he says, so for example, on page 303, so when someone says, well, the doctor in that case isn't doing anything, right? They're not doing anything. In fact, it's just the natural condition of the infant's body, which is leading to the result of death of the organism. But Rachel says, the first important point is that it's not exactly correct to say that in passive euthanasia, the doctor does nothing, for he does do one thing that is very important. He lets the patient die. He's letting the patient die when, as we've seen in this particular example, a simple surgery would have prevented it. That would be like under ordinary circumstances. You go into the hospital because of some particular illness or bodily malady, and you, as a non-expert, you don't exactly know what it is. The physician does. Perhaps they identify the issue immediately. There is a more or less clear and guaranteed to be successful treatment plan. But for whatever reason, the doctor's like, I can get to it later, or I don't really feel like doing that, or I don't really like the look of this guy. For whatever reason, they decide not to do it. The patient dies. Could the doctor say, well, I didn't do anything. I didn't kill the patient. Well, no, that would not hold up as a strong defense in court, right? So this is all just to say that there is no real moral difference between the two. And so to hone in on that point some more, he says, for example, one may let a patient die by way of not giving medication, just as I described, just as one may insult someone by way of not shaking his hand. But for any purpose of moral assessment, it is a type of action nonetheless. The decision to let a patient die is subject to moral appraisal in the same way that a decision to kill him would be subject to moral appraisal. So in both cases of non-action, which is intentional non-action, it's not accidental, non-action or a kind of action, in both cases, it may be assessed as wise or unwise, compassionate or sadistic, right or wrong. If a doctor deliberately let a patient die who is suffering from a routinely curable illness, the doctor would certainly be to blame for what he had done, just as he would be to blame if he had needlessly killed the patient. Charges against him would then be appropriate. If so, it would be no defense at all for him to insist that he didn't do anything. He would have done something very serious indeed, for he let his patient die. Okay, now as far as I understand his argument, Gay Williams doesn't have much of a response at all to this view. Or am I missing something? What do you guys think? How might, if it's not explicit, how might Gay Williams respond to this argument of Rachel's? Yeah, exactly. So I just saw that Diana said in the chat, isn't choosing the option of letting him die and not doing anything about it doing something. A choice is doing something. Right, exactly. So that's the crux of Rachel's argument on this point, is it's not an accident, such as those instances where after discussion with the parents, one would not want to preserve the life of a child with Down syndrome, right, because of quality of life issues or whatever, but it's only the accidental concomitants of this intestinal blockage that allows the doctor to, as it were, seize a loophole to allow the child to die, so that I would say the parents themselves don't have to deal with a child with Down syndrome. And you could deploy a number of arguments either way to support that, but I think Rachel's point is right, that however you decide and however the decision is made in coordination with the parents and other important figures involved, the outcome of the infant just languishing for days and having to die through that reason is needlessly cruel, right? And that's really the upshot of Rachel's argument. He's not saying that one should kill Down syndrome babies or not kill Down syndrome babies. He's saying that there are ways to go about making that decision, but either way, if the end result is simply allowing the fetus to just sit there and die after languishing over a period of days, seems, when it's preventable, is the important caveat. When it's preventable, seems perhaps even worse morally than if the doctor were to, put a pillow over the baby's head. What do you guys think about that?
I feel like, I understand where he's coming from and how he's trying to prove that in this circumstance, if death is going to be the result, then euthanasia might be better. But I feel like he's kind of opening himself up to critique because he's bringing up this idea of quality of life. And I think that's a problem that a lot of people who are anti-euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide struggle with, because who's to say that a parent or a doctor or a judge can just decide that someone's life isn't valuable? Because saying that their life no longer has any value seems really hopeless, especially if that person themselves has decided that their life doesn't matter. Then aren't they hopeless? And isn't that also a main component in depression, that this person is hopeless? So why, if this person has no hope, can they just decide that their life no longer matters? That seems unhealthily biased. And I don't think it's right that a parent can just say that since their child has this problem, that they no longer have the right to life because their life wouldn't matter. Because people with autism, their life matters. It's not like, it doesn't really seem to make any sense. And he seems to be opening himself up to other critiques that kind of overshadow what he's originally trying to say.
No, that's a really strong point. However, we should be careful to identify what exactly Rachel's is arguing, what exactly he's advocating for, right? He leaves aside the question as to whether these quality of life issues should be of legitimate moral import. That's not part of his argument. He's not saying one way or the other that we should kill Down syndrome babies or babies with autism. His point, and so this is, a subtle distinction to clarify, his point is, if we think, however we land on that particular issue, that allowing the child to die because of an intestinal blockage is acceptable morally, well then why shouldn't we think, given the intended result with that withholding of medical care, then why shouldn't we also think that if we could bring ourselves, or more accurately, bring the infant to that result of death more quickly, more humanely, with less pain, that's not also, in fact, much more strongly morally permissible, right? So his whole argument here is about the functional identity, that is, the equivalency between passive and active euthanasia. That's really all he's trying to conclude. He's not saying that we should all embrace euthanasia proper, whether passive or active. He's just saying, if we think that it's okay to allow people, as the AMA says, right, as the American Medical Association clearly articulates in their policy, that if it's acceptable for us, if it's acceptable for medical personnel to allow patients to die because of the natural fulfillment of whatever ails them, well then, why not put in place practices to bring that end about more quickly, more humanely, and with less pain? Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but I feel like it still doesn't work, because this baby like has the ability to live if this simple thing is performed. Like, it has a promise of life and it's the beginning of life, versus at the end of life, like you can only let someone die if there's no other like situation for them. Whereas this baby has a possibility and has like they have the ability to live if this thing or this ailment is fixed within them, whereas someone who's being let die doesn't have that option. There is no other option.
Yeah, but his whole point again is that it's not whether or not we should let the baby die or save the baby or kill the baby or whatever else. He's simply saying that the decision to allow the baby to just sit there by itself and die of its own natural causes over a series of days is not morally better than immediately giving a lethal injection that would put an end to the suffering at once, right? So he's not saying that we should kill babies with Down syndrome or autism or whatever else, or that we shouldn't, right? That's not his argument. What he's trying to clarify is that there's no significant difference between letting die and killing. And so the baby example is particularly forceful because of what medical personnel have commented on in terms of their experience with this. Like the parents that have the conversation with the doctors and they say, yeah, this baby has Down syndrome, but there's this now expedient loophole of an intestinal blockage that we can seize on in order to end the life. Well, the parent after that discussion doesn't have to confront the reality of what happens after that. They don't go back to the nursery, right? It's out of sight, out of mind. But for doctors and nurses that have to walk by and see this infant just sitting there, just dying and not doing anything about it because they're just letting the baby die, that seems really needlessly cruel. So if you've made the decision, if you've already decided that this baby is going to die, well, why not just do it quickly? But again, the question that Rachel's is posing and the conclusion that he brings us to has nothing to do with whether or not we should either let the baby die or kill it in the first place. He's just trying to say that letting die and killing are no different. The only difference, the only real question then is, if you've decided one way or the other, how quickly and how humanely are you going to bring about this projected decision to its fulfillment, to its result? So does that make sense? But I think you're totally right that we shouldn't just willy-nilly end the lives of infants because they have particular disabilities that we would find a challenge either for ourselves as parents or for the child, right? So someone with Down syndrome or with autism can lead a perfectly healthy and otherwise perfectly healthy and fruitful and productive life. And they might actually say, once they've developed reason, language, and autonomy, thank you, mother and father, for not killing me as a child, right? So yeah, I think that your point is correct, but we just need to be clear about exactly what Rachel's is arguing and defending, right? So does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand that. I know we're taking up like a huge part of class, but it's just the idea that we can kind of compare killing and letting die at the beginning of life versus at the end of life, because it seems like there are other factors in play that would skew someone into thinking something is right at the beginning of life versus at the end of life, because it's just different.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like if you're thinking about that in those two different contexts, it's harder to understand objectively if they're the same or not the same.
So you're saying if you're dealing with, say, a functional adult who maybe is a resident of Oregon or becomes a resident of Oregon, and they are a candidate for the Death with Dignity Act, and they go into it, they sign all the paperwork, they check all the boxes. The moral question in that kind of case, in terms of active killing or letting die, is different from cases in which you're dealing with an infant. Is that what you're getting at?
I'm not sure. It just feels like there's something there that just kind of, I don't know, something that's more intuitive, maybe.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So yeah, I mean, I think I understand, but let me see what Connor was saying. Okay. Yeah. So this discussion of killing babies is, cringeworthy, as he puts it, depressing. But are there any other comments or questions about this? Any other points that you'd like to make that we haven't addressed or that the presenters didn't present or give expression to?
I liked what Poppy just said, in that, like, I think there is a big difference on, whether somebody's at the end of their life or at the beginning of it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that difference is very clear when we're talking about the distinction between voluntary and non-voluntary. That is, there's no sense in which an infant, for example, can engage in the voluntary decision, right? It's always going to be non-voluntary. And so this is important because if you have, and there are many nuances in terms of this particular landscape that we're addressing, you might think that voluntary active euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide is acceptable, but even non-voluntary is not. So you wouldn't even accept someone's advance directive. You might think that, no, that's not okay because we need to deal with the person actively at the present moment, given that they might change their mind, right? And so if we're dealing with an infant, well, then that problem is just more pronounced. It's just more obvious and more acute. The difference between voluntary and non-voluntary. And then of course, involuntary is just straight up murder, as we've talked about before. Okay, so if there are no more comments or questions, we'll get out of here early, but I wanted to share a comedic, a rather funny news story that's relatively recent. It's from November 2019. So let me share the screen here. And it's relevant to this issue, and it's also relevant to issues in ethics of criminal justice, which we talked a little bit about too. So, oops, let me pull this article up. And it's very short, and I think it's pretty hilarious. And maybe some of you heard about this when it came out. So there's this incident involving an inmate in Iowa. So this guy, so this is the inmate, convicted murderer who momentarily died, says his life sentence has been served. So an Iowa inmate serving a life sentence says he should be a free man after he became ill, momentarily died, and had to be revived at the hospital. But the courts are having none of it, as you might expect. So Benjamin Schreiber was sentenced to life in prison without parole in 1997 after being convicted of first-degree murder. In March 2015, he developed large kidney stones that led to septic poisoning, according to court documents. He eventually fell unconscious in his cell and was taken to a local hospital where he was resuscitated 5 separate times, the document says. According to the Iowa Court of Appeals, Schreiber, quote, claims he momentarily died at the hospital, thereby fulfilling his life sentence. Because his sentence had been fulfilled, he argues, he is imprisoned illegally and should be immediately released. A district court previously denied Schreiber's motion, and on Wednesday, the Iowa Court of Appeals upheld the lower court's decision. In its opinion, the appeals court said a plain reading of Iowa law says the defendants guilty of a Class A felony, quote, must spend the rest of their natural life in prison, regardless of how long that period of time ends up being, or any events occurring before the defendant's life ends. And here is the punchline. This is hilarious to me. Schreiber is either alive, in which case he must remain in prison, Judge Amanda Potterfield wrote, or he is dead, in which case this appeal is moot. An attorney for Schreiber did not immediately respond to requests for comment Friday morning. It's unclear whether Schreiber plans to take the case to a higher court. So what do you guys think about that? Was Schreiber right in his argument? Should he be released or no? Or do you think that the Court of Appeals made the right decision?
I think the court made the right decision, but I think that he's, I gotta give him credit.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really fault him for the effort, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to go through the effort of dying and coming back to life, I mean, in a sense, like, he's not wrong. Like, he served his life sentence. I mean, like, they're not obviously.
It was a
they weren't gonna
temporary
release him,
interruption
but-
in his life, right?
All right, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, by a weird technical linguistic interpretation, he's right. But I really love the court's official decision. Either he's alive and he has to stay in prison, or he's dead. In which case, why are we having this conversation? I think that's great. Sometimes it must be fun to be a judge. I don't know. But okay, are there any final comments or questions before we go? So nice job. Let's give our two groups another round of applause. And so next week, we'll have groups 5 and 6 lead us through, so this is next Wednesday, lead us through a discussion, a kind of debate as we did today and last week on the issue of environmental ethics. In particular, we'll be focusing on climate change. All right, so have a good weekend. In groups 5 and 6, expect an email from me at some point this afternoon or this evening with some further guidance. So have a good weekend. I'll see you guys on Monday.